The courtroom was heavy with anticipation, the kind of oppressive silence that seemed to weigh down the very air, each breath taken with measured caution. The walls, lined with faded wood and gold-trimmed molding, bore witness to countless cases. But today felt different. The clattering of the gavel signaled the beginning of yet another day, but beneath it, an undercurrent of tension vibrated through the room. As the judge settled into his seat, a quiet murmur filled the space, eyes darting between the lawyers, the audience, and most notably, the defendant. A black man sitting in the defendant's chair, his posture upright, yet burdened with an invisible weight. It had been a long, drawn-out trial, one that had garnered the attention of the public. The case was one of those that seemed to stick with you, its complexity reaching beyond the details of the accusations. The courtroom was split, divided between those who believed in the righteousness of the law and others who whispered about a story hidden beneath the surface. Today, however, was different. Today, the final argument would be made. The protagonist of the day was an imposing figure, but not in the way that most would expect. His name was Michael Walker, a name that didn't carry weight in the usual sense. He wasn't a celebrity, nor did he come from a wealthy family. He wasn't a politician or a public figure who had been widely known for anything other than his profession. Yet as he sat in that courtroom, his silence spoke volumes. Michael was a man shaped by experiences, by the unspoken struggles that many couldn't see, but which had carved deep lines into his soul. He had seen the injustices of the world, felt them, and yet had spent his life doing everything he could to right them. His eyes, though calm on the outside, hid a tempest within, an emotional depth that he had long buried behind a mask of stoicism. The case, though not one of national interest in the way others might have been, had caught attention. The defendant, a black man accused of assaulting a white police officer during a routine traffic stop, had been fighting against what many believed was a miscarriage of justice, a story that seemed to repeat itself time and time again. Yet, as the trial went on, there had been no real sign of any breakthrough. The evidence was circumstantial, the testimonies shaky at best. But the prosecution seemed to have the upper hand, and the judge, a man known for his conservative leanings, was inclined to side with the law, no matter how it was interpreted. Today was the day that would decide everything. Michael stood at the defense table, his back straight, his mind racing. There was no turning back. The whispers around the room grew louder as the clock ticked closer to the final moments. Some of the officers exchanged looks, their expressions dismissive, while others studied Michael intently. He could feel their gazes, some filled with distrust, others veiled with contempt. But he had long ago learned to block out the noise. It wasn't the stares that worried him. It was the unspoken understanding that things might not go in his favor today. As the judge turned his eyes to the room, the tension reached a boiling point. Michael felt the weight of the moment, the culmination of years of work leading up to this very moment. He wasn't just defending an individual in this case. No, this was bigger than that. It was about everything that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long. Years of bias, years of prejudice, years of systemic injustice that he had spent his life trying to fight against. And now it all rested on the edge of a decision that could change everything or reinforce the status quo. The prosecutor, a man with sharp features and a glint of self-assuredness, took his position, his voice steady, as he made his closing statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "we have all the evidence we need to confirm the guilt of the defendant. This is not about race, not about background. It's about what happened that day when the defendant chose to resist authority." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "We ask that you find him guilty of all charges." The room seemed to hold its breath as the judge nodded, taking notes. Michael's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he said nothing. He had already said all he needed to in the previous days. Now was the time for the final blow, the one that could turn everything around. He turned his attention toward the judge, his gaze unwavering. As the judge prepared to speak, the faint sound of footsteps echoed behind him. Michael's heart skipped a beat, but he forced himself to focus. A few moments later, the door to the courtroom opened and a figure stepped inside. The room, which had already been thick with tension, grew heavier. Heads turned, whispers erupted, and the judge paused, his gaze flicking toward the newcomer. It was Michael's turn. He slowly rose to his feet, his voice calm yet firm, but the room fell silent as the full force of his presence filled the space. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "I understand the weight of the charges against my client, but I believe there is something you may have missed." The judge, who had been prepared to dismiss the case and pass judgment, narrowed his eyes. "What is it that you believe I have missed, Mr. Walker?" he asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. Michael took a deep breath. This was the moment. His hand slid into the pocket of his coat, his fingers brushing against something cold. He pulled out a small card, crisp and official-looking, and held it up for the judge to see. "I am not just a defense attorney," he said slowly, his words deliberate, each one landing with quiet power. "I am a United States attorney, and I have spent my career fighting for justice, not just for the innocent, but for all of us, including the men and women who have been denied justice because of biases, because of a system that has failed them time and time again." The room fell dead silent. The judge's face, which had been hard with skepticism, faltered for a brief moment as if he were unsure how to respond. The tension in the room crackled, thick with disbelief. Michael's revelation hung in the air, like an electric current, charging the space with a new, undeniable force. The officers, once so sure of their position, looked unsure, their eyes darting from the judge to the man who had just changed everything. But before anyone could speak, the judge's gavel slammed down, and he called for a brief recess. The outcome of this case, which had seemed so certain just moments ago, now lay in the balance. Nothing was clear anymore. Michael stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, his future uncertain, knowing that whatever came next would have far-reaching consequences for them all. The recess was brief, but for Michael, it felt like a lifetime. He stepped outside the courtroom, the weight of the moment hanging heavily on his shoulders. He leaned against the cold stone wall, his eyes closed, trying to steady his breath. The revelation had felt inevitable in some ways, but now that it was out there, it seemed like everything was different. It wasn't just about this case anymore. It was about everything. The years he had spent trying to prove himself, trying to navigate a system that seemed so firmly against him. Michael had not always been the man standing in front of a judge with the title of United States Attorney behind his name. He had come from a small town, the kind of place where people knew each other's business, and your background could define your future before you ever had a chance to shape it for yourself. Raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep the family afloat, Michael had learned early on that life wasn't fair. He watched his mother fight for their survival, all the while facing the harsh realities of systemic inequalities that seemed to mock her every step. But she never gave up. She had always told him, "Michael, you can be more than what this world says you are. Just never stop trying." Her words were his anchor, especially in times like this, times when the world around him seemed determined to prove her wrong. He had fought tooth and nail to get where he was, earning every inch of respect he had ever received, and still it felt like he had to prove himself every day, as though he had to carry the weight of his entire community on his back. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft shuffle of footsteps approaching him. He opened his eyes to see his colleague, Detective Maria Thompson, stepping out of the courthouse doors, her face tense. She was a familiar face, someone he had worked with for years, and yet even her presence now didn't bring the comfort it once did. "Michael," she said, her voice low, almost hesitant. "Are you okay?" He met her gaze and nodded, though he wasn't sure whether it was meant to reassure her or himself. "Yeah, just needed a minute." Maria stepped closer, her eyes scanning the area around them before landing back on Michael. "You really dropped a bomb in there. United States. Attorney? That's big. But you know they're not going to take it well, right?" Michael sighed, running a hand over his face. "I didn't have a choice. If I didn't say it now, I don't know when I would have had the chance again." Maria's eyes softened, but she didn't speak right away. The tension between them was palpable. They had known each other for years, but there was a distance now, something that hadn't been there before. Maria was a good detective, sharp and unflinching, but even she couldn't fully understand the pressure Michael was under. The system that he fought against every day wasn't just something he read about or discussed in a courtroom. It was something he had lived. "You think you can win this?" Maria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael looked at her, his eyes narrowing. He wasn't sure how to answer. "I have to. I have no choice. It's not just about this case anymore, Maria. It's about showing them that it's possible, that a system built on these biases can be changed. But every time I step into that room, I can feel it. They see me differently now. They don't see the lawyer, the prosecutor, the attorney. They see the color of my skin." She nodded slowly, her expression understanding, but that did little to ease the weight on Michael's chest. He had spent so many years pushing past those quiet whispers and glances, working tirelessly to earn the right to be where he was. He had come so far, but in some ways, it felt like it was never enough. Each new challenge was a reminder that the world would never see him as equal, no matter how many titles he held or how many credentials he earned. "I know you're carrying a lot," Maria said softly, "but don't let this case break you. You've done good work. Don't let them make you question it." Michael met her gaze, but the words didn't bring the comfort he had hoped for. They simply highlighted the chasm between them, the way the world had divided them into categories that felt impossible to escape. Just as he was about to speak again, a voice from behind interrupted them. "Mr. Walker." A word. The voice was deep, firm, but carried a hint of uncertainty. It was Judge Palmer's clerk, a young man named Eli, who had been working with the judge for several years. Michael turned, his stomach sinking as he followed Eli back into the courthouse. The clerk didn't speak, but there was a visible tension in his posture, something that told Michael that the storm was far from over. As they walked back into the courtroom, the scene inside was even more charged than before. The murmurs from the gallery grew louder as Michael entered, eyes shifting toward him with a mix of curiosity and judgment. The judge sat high in his chair, his gavel resting against the desk as he watched Michael approach, his face unreadable. "Mr. Walker," the judge finally said, his voice calm but betraying a hint of irritation. "I must admit I was not expecting this revelation. But now that it's out in the open, I must ask, are you truly capable of impartiality? Do you understand the weight of what you're asking for?" Michael's heart pounded in his chest. The words were calculated, and though they seemed innocuous, they were laced with suspicion, a challenge to everything Michael had worked for. He knew what the judge was implying, that his position as a U.S. attorney could cloud his judgment, that his past, his skin, would make it impossible for him to remain unbiased. The very thing he had fought so hard to overcome was now the very thing that could undo him. "I'm here to do what's right," Michael said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "And I have always been willing to face the consequences for it." The judge's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Michael could see the hesitation in the older man's gaze. But then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by a steely resolve. "We'll see," the judge said, his voice final. "We'll see." The gavel came down again, and the courtroom fell silent. As Michael stood there, he couldn't help but wonder what would come next. What had he really uncovered? Had he opened a door to justice, or had he walked into a trap? The uncertainty gnawed at him as he looked around the room, aware that this case was far from over, and the challenges he faced were only just beginning. The day after the courtroom revelation, the tension only grew. Michael Walker knew that everything had changed. The weight of his position as a United States attorney was now a double-edged sword. On one hand, it elevated him to a status of authority, but on the other, it made him a target. The judge's dismissive response, the subtle glares from the officers, and the calculated silence from the prosecution all felt like warnings. Michael wasn't just fighting for the truth now. He was fighting to prove that his skin didn't define his competence, that his history didn't dictate his future. By the time the second session of the trial rolled around, Michael had begun to feel the walls closing in. As he sat across from the prosecutor, Adrian Grant, he could feel the cold eyes of the opposing counsel drilling into him. Grant was a seasoned attorney, slick, charming when he needed to be, but ruthless when it counted. From the moment Michael had entered the courtroom, Grant's demeanor had shifted from professional courtesy to something more insidious, something that made Michael's skin crawl. "You've got quite the story, don't you, Mr. Walker?" Grant's voice oozed with a smirk as he addressed Michael. "A U.S. attorney with a personal stake in a case like this. What's your real interest here? Justice or something else?" Michael fought to keep his voice steady. "My interest is in seeing the truth prevail." Grant raised an eyebrow, the smirk widening. "Is it? Or is this just a way for you to flex your muscles to show everyone how important you are? We all know how eager people like you are to prove themselves, especially when the stakes are so high." There it was, the first of many subtle digs that would come over the course of the trial. Michael had faced this kind of thing before, but now it felt different. It wasn't just about winning the case anymore. It was about proving that he belonged. He wasn't sure if it was Grant's words or the atmosphere of the courtroom itself, but Michael suddenly felt a shift within himself. The quiet self-doubt that had been gnawing at him these last few days bubbled to the surface, threatening to overtake him. "Are you implying I'm doing this for personal gain?" Michael asked, his voice colder now, the facade of calm starting to crack. Grant leaned in slightly, his voice low and mocking. "I'm just saying there's a lot of power in this courtroom, and you've been making sure everyone knows it. But I'm not convinced you have the right reasons for being here, and frankly, neither is anyone else." The words hit harder than they should have. Michael's mind raced. He had prepared for this, for the hostility, the bias, the need to justify his very existence in the courtroom. But hearing it from someone like Grant, someone so skilled in turning the truth into something unrecognizable, felt like a blow to his core. He knew Grant's accusations were intended to sow doubt, to fracture the public perception of him, and it was working. The whispers in the gallery seemed louder now, and when he glanced up, he caught the eyes of a few of the officers. Eyes that had once seemed indifferent, but now they seemed more accusatory. In the silence that followed, Michael's thoughts were a whirlwind. This was his fight, and he couldn't let the weight of these words bring him down. Not now, not after everything he had sacrificed. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. "You can be more than what the world says you are." He had to push through this, for her, for every person who had been told they weren't enough. But as the trial wore on, the strain was palpable. The subtle microaggressions became more overt. A slight glance here, a dismissive comment there, each one wearing away at Michael's resolve. During one break in the trial, he found himself alone in the men's restroom, staring at his reflection. In the mirror, his face, usually stoic, looked foreign to him now, tired, worn down. The man he saw wasn't the confident attorney who had once risen to his position with determination. He was a man stretched thin, fighting against forces far larger than himself. He could almost hear the questions that had plagued him since he first started his career. Was this worth it? Was he really making a difference, or was he just another pawn in a broken system? Suddenly, the door to the restroom swung open, and Michael was snapped out of his thoughts. He turned quickly, his pulse quickening, only to see Maria standing in the doorway. She looked as if she had been waiting for him, her eyes searching, his face with a mixture of concern and caution. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft but insistent. Michael didn't know how to answer. He couldn't say he was okay. He wasn't. But the last thing he wanted was to show vulnerability now. He had been pushing people away for years, hiding behind the walls of his professional life to shield his emotions, to let anyone see how much this case, how much this fight had begun to eat away at him, felt like the ultimate betrayal to everything he had worked for. "I'm fine," he said, forcing a smile he didn't feel. "Just a little tired." Maria didn't seem convinced, but she didn't press him further. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Look, I know things are getting rough, but you've got this. Don't let them get to you. I've seen you go up against bigger odds than this, and you always come out on top." Michael's throat tightened, and for a brief moment he allowed himself to let her words sink in. But even her comfort couldn't erase the gnawing feeling in his gut. The case was slipping from his grasp. He could feel it. The judge's attitude had shifted. The prosecutor's attacks were getting sharper. And in the midst of all of this, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was pulling the strings from behind the scenes. He wasn't just battling the prosecution anymore. He was battling a system that was rigged against him, a system that had always been stacked in favor of the people sitting across from him. Later that afternoon, Michael found himself in the hallway outside the courtroom, looking over his notes. He was reviewing the key arguments when he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Eli, the judge's clerk, standing there with a worried expression on his face. "Mr. Walker," Eli said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I think you need to know something. The judge, he's been getting some pressure about this case. It's not just coming from the prosecution." Michael's brow furrowed, his pulse quickening. "What do you mean? I can't go into details, but I think there's someone else involved. Someone who's making sure this case doesn't go in your favor." Michael's heart skipped a beat. The air around him seemed to thicken as the weight of Eli's words sank in. "Who?" Eli hesitated, his gaze darting nervously over his shoulder. "I can't say, but just be careful. You're not alone in this, and I don't think it's going to end how you think." Before Michael could respond, Eli turned quickly and disappeared down the hallway, leaving Michael standing there, his mind racing. Someone else? Michael's grip on his notes tightened as he realized the scope of what he was up against was far bigger than he had ever imagined. He wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting to survive in a system that was determined to crush him at every turn. The courtroom doors opened, signaling the beginning of the next session, but Michael hesitated before walking back inside. His thoughts were too clouded, too uncertain. He didn't know who was behind this, but whoever it was, he knew they were pulling strings that ran deeper than he had ever feared. The weight of his past struggles and the pressure of his current fight seemed to collide in that moment. As he stepped into the courtroom once more, the gavel sounded, but the storm that was about to unfold had only just begun. The tension between him and his adversaries was palpable, and Michael knew that the most crucial battle of his life was about to begin, not just for this case, but for everything he had worked so hard to build. The days blurred together as the trial dragged on. each moment feeling more suffocating than the last. Michael Walker's resolve was being tested in ways he had never imagined. The courtroom had become a battleground, not just for his client, but for everything he believed in. Every time he stepped up to address the judge or the jury, he could feel the weight of the eyes upon him, the whispers in the gallery, the cold stares of the officers, the subtle smirks from Adrian Grant. It was all closing in on him. And yet, despite the mounting pressure, there was something inside him, some ember of defiance, that refused to be extinguished, but it was getting harder to fight. The breakthrough Michael had hoped for never came. Each piece of evidence he presented seemed to be overshadowed by Grant's sharp counter-arguments. The prosecutor had become more aggressive, more personal in his attacks. Every cross-examination, every objection was another blow to Michael's fragile sense of control. And then there was the judge, his growing hostility unmistakable. It was clear now the system wasn't just stacked against Michael. It had been rigged from the start. Grant had no intention of letting up. He was relentless, taking every opportunity to undermine Michael, casting doubts on his integrity. In one particularly heated moment, during a particularly tense cross-examination, Grant made a pointed remark that stung deeper than anything Michael had expected. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you, Mr. Walker?" Grant said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Standing up there, trying to play the martyr. The only thing you've managed to do is let your ego cloud your judgment. This isn't about justice. This is about you proving that you belong." "But you don't, do you? You've never belonged." The words hit harder than Michael cared to admit. He could feel the eyes of the jury on him, their skepticism palpable. It was as if everything he had worked for, the career, the reputation, the countless hours spent fighting for justice, was being torn down in front of him, piece by piece. For a moment, his mind went blank, the stares and the accusations a blur. He wanted to lash out, to argue, to prove that Grant was wrong, that he wasn't just here for himself, but his hands clenched at his sides, his breath shallow. "Stay calm," he reminded himself. "This isn't about him. It's about doing what's right." But staying calm was getting harder by the day. The stress was taking its toll. His sleep had become erratic, his meals few and far between. He could feel the exhaustion creeping into his bones, making his movements sluggish, his thoughts fragmented. He was operating on fumes, and he knew it. The weight of the case, of the constant barrage of doubt, of the relentless push against him, it was all catching up. But there was no room for weakness, no time for breaks. If he faltered now, everything would collapse. One evening, as the trial recessed for the day, Michael found himself in the courthouse lobby, his briefcase gripped tightly in his hand. He was alone, save for a few lingering staff members. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. When he pulled it out, he saw a message from Maria. "Call me. Important." Michael's stomach tightened. Maria had been his rock throughout this entire process, the only one who seemed to truly understand the toll the case was taking on him. But even her presence was starting to feel strained. She had always been a steady force, but lately her concern had become palpable, almost desperate. He knew she didn't want him to burn out, but what choice did he have? The trial had become everything. He quickly dialed her number, his thumb pressing the call button before he could second-guess himself. "Maria," he said when she answered, his voice low, almost frantic. "What's going on?" "You're not going to like this," Maria said, her tone urgent. "I've been looking into the judge. There's something you need to know." Michael froze. The judge, the man who had seemed so distant, so impartial in the beginning, but who had turned on him with a quiet vengeance. He knew there had been something off about Judge Palmer, but he hadn't been able to put his finger on it. "What is it?" Michael asked, his pulse quickening. Maria's voice dropped to a whisper, even though Michael could hear the hum of the courthouse in the background. I did some digging, and I found out that Palmer has ties to the very officers involved in the case. I'm not saying he's corrupt, but his loyalty isn't to the law, it's to them. He's been under pressure to rule in their favor, Michael. He's part of the system that's out to get you. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Michael's head spun as he tried to process what she was saying. The judge, a man who was supposed to uphold justice, was compromised. How could that be? How could this whole system be so rotten? And more importantly, how could he fight it when the very person responsible for making the final decision was working against him? You're sure about this? Michael asked, his voice barely audible. I'm sure, Maria replied. I don't know what you're going to do with this, but you need to know. You're not just fighting for your client anymore. You're fighting a system that's set up to crush people like you, like him. She paused, the weight of her words hanging in the air. I'm sorry, Michael. I wish I could help more. Before he could respond, the line went dead. Michael stood there for a moment, staring at the phone in his hand. His breath came in shallow bursts as he processed what Maria had just revealed. Everything, the trial, the judge's behavior, the mounting pressure, it all made sense now. But that didn't make it any easier. If the judge was compromised, how could he ever expect a fair trial? How could he expect any justice? Just then, the doors to the courthouse swung open, and Michael heard the unmistakable voice of Adrian Grant. In the distance, "You're wasting your time, Walker," Grant called out, his tone sharp and mocking. "All your efforts, all your grand speeches, they don't mean a thing. The game's already been decided. You're not going to win. It's over." Michael's jaw clenched as he turned toward the voice. Grant was standing at the far end of the hall, a smug grin plastered on his face. The arrogance in his eyes was unmistakable, and Michael knew that Grant believed he had already won. It wasn't just about the case anymore. Grant was toying with him, trying to break him, but Michael wasn't going to let him. Not now. Not after everything. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. "You're not going to break me," he thought. "I've come too far." But as he began to walk toward Grant, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. There, standing in the shadows, was someone he hadn't expected to see. A figure cloaked in darkness, watching him with eyes that sent a chill down his spine. The figure stepped forward just as Michael was about to reach Grant, and with that single step, the weight of everything Michael had been fighting, before shifted. The mystery of who had been pulling the strings, who had been orchestrating his downfall, was about to be revealed. But just as Michael reached out to confront the person in the shadows, the courthouse lights flickered and went out. Everything went black, and in that moment Michael knew nothing would ever be the same again.